Hi,
Hello,
introduce yourself.
my name is Patricia Jones, and I am Bree Hughes' grandmother, and I was born on June 6th, 1947.
What do you think is the biggest change you've seen from then to now?
Well, I could take that in several different regards. I think that in the last 60, 65 years, we've gone through a lot of changes in our country. Um, I think we've become more accepting of different viewpoints. I think we've become more open minded so that we can live more in peace. Unfortunately, that's not the case throughout the world. Now, since this is something for my granddaughter, and I'm thinking about how times would have changed for a 17-year-old then and a 17-year-old now, I think the doors have been opened to her so that she's got much more opportunity. Back in my era, it was accepted that women went in one direction and men went in the other.
More on that. What as when back when you were a teenager or a child, what was the expected role you were expected to fill as a woman in society? Or what did you see your mother doing?
Well, I had I think a very unusual situation because I came from a mother whose own mother had been an immigrant from Ireland, and my grandmother had only had a third grade education. So when she came to this country and she had her family, she had two girls and a boy. She wanted much more for them, and being educated was probably her priority. Um, my mother would tell me stories of how she had to achieve 99 or 100 in all her subjects, or else it was not acceptable. She carried on that same tradition when she had grandchildren, and I still remember living in fear that I wouldn't have a perfect grade point average because my grandmother would be upset with me. My mother was never that demanding when it came to our grades. I think my family put their own pressure on themselves to achieve. I think partially because we wanted to show that each generation was doing better than the prior generation. So when I achieved a master's degree after college, and my brother did the same, my grandmother was just in awe that she would have grandchildren that achieved such success. I don't think that the pressure was put on us. I think we just naturally wanted to move forward. Now, as far as the roles for men and women when I graduated from high school, I felt in my time, my choices, and you probably hear this from a lot of baby boomers, I had choices of probably becoming a nurse, an educator, or a librarian. Now, other people, I came from a very middle class family. Other women might have been given the opportunity to become lawyers or doctors, but that was not considered something that in my family I could achieve. Of course, I could have done that later on in life, but I went on to become an educator and I was very happy with that position. But when my mother graduated from high school, women went off to work. They became, secretarial, office workers, worked for the government, and it was never an opportunity for her to go to college. So she made sure that I was given that opportunity. Many of my own peers did not go to college, and I felt really bad that they weren't given that opportunity. But again, it was that stress on education. The one thing that my mom always said is that you need to be educated and you need to be an independent woman. You shouldn't have to rely on anybody. And I carried that thought throughout my life.
What was your childhood like with regards to the how the war had ended a little while before you were born? But how do you think that affected the way your family and your parents viewed things?
We had a very peaceful, nuclear family. My brother was 5 years older. He came before the war, and I came after the war. Life was very simple. We lived in a small town in Queens, New York. Everyone who lived on our street basically came from the same generation. The dads had been in the military and the moms had been home during the war while their husbands, spouses, and partners were away. But we all basically came from the same generation. There was very little talk about the war. I knew my dad had been in the war. He was in the Air Force. There was very little talk about what his role was. He only talked about that later on in life, and especially since I studied history, I wanted to learn more about what his role was. But we had a very simple kind of Ozzie and Harriet childhood.
Do you think, like, you were alive during the beginning of, like, the Cold War? How do you think, like, you really paid attention to that, or, like, do you think that, like, affected the way you behaved or thought about things?
I knew that the Cold War was going on, and we did talk about that in school a bit as I went up through the grades. But honestly, in my every day-to-day existence, I don't think I even thought about the Cold War. The one thing that comes back in my memory about that era was dictators like Fidel Castro. And I remember the standoff that Kennedy had with Fidel Castro during the Bay of Pigs. And the country was very stressed out, thinking that we could be attacked, especially, our country. Excuse me a minute. Can you stop it for a minute?
Okay. Yeah, so before we were interrupted, you were talking about the dictators and the fear of being attacked.
Right. And there was always the news clips that we got to kind of get an insight as to what was going on in the world when they showed the premier of Russia, Nikita Khrushchev. He appeared at the United Nations, and it was during the time when President Kennedy was the president of our country, I guess around 61, 62, because he was assassinated in 63. The belligerence of him not wanting to listen to anybody else's opinion, and the crudeness. He took his shoe off and he banged it on the table in the UN, and everybody was just shocked that any world leader could behave like that. So you knew that there was a total opposition when it came to looking at a democracy that we came from as opposed to a communistic regime that he was leading. So that I do remember.
No, last question, because we're almost out of time. But what do you think, like, as a child, your biggest, like, worry or concern was throughout day-to-day life?
I honestly have to say I had a very, very pleasant, very happy, stress-free childhood. I think the health of my parents and my family was always a major concern, because going up through the 50s into the early 60s, I could see some of my older relatives and some of my friends' relatives. They were getting older, and we would hear that somebody had cancer, for example, and we knew that, right away that person would no longer be with us. Now we can see that, we don't have that so much as a stress factor in children today, because we know that medicine has moved us that much further on. But I don't think I really had that much stress, and I have to say it was very pleasant. So I was very thankful for that.
Yeah, well, thank you for your time.
Well, you're welcome.